Greetings. Father Mark signing on, picking up where we left off last time. We left off with the death of Pope Alexander VI on August the 18th, 1503. So we move now into the 215th Pope, Pius III. He was a maternal nephew of Pope Pius II. His baptismal name was Francesco Todeschini Piccolomini. Piccolomini. Born in Siena, Italy, 1439. Uncle Pius, when as Pope, appointed him Cardinal Archbishop of Siena when he was in the year 1460, when he was 21 years old. See, the feudalism problem. Despite this, surprisingly, he turned out to not be a parasite. He worked hard, he worked diligently in all of his jobs. He learned English and German in addition to his native Italian. He ably represented church interest in those two countries, and he served with integrity as governor of Ancona, which is in the Papal State on the eastern coast of Italy, the Adriatic coast of Italy. He was elderly and in poor health during the first conclave of 1503, so he was elected as a safe compromise candidate. But as it happened, he was too frail, and he died 26 days later. He died on the 18th of October, 1503. Followed as Pope 216 by Julius II. Baptized Giuliano della Rovere. So the Giuliano, and then there's it's not a middle name, but it's a Della, it's a particle, Della. Then the last name Rovere, Rovere. Born on December 5th, 1453, near Savona, Italy. Savona is the northwest Italy. It is 25 miles west of Genoa. He was born into an impoverished family. On the 19th of May, 1464, his uncle, Father Francesco della Rovere, was elected Master General of the Order of Friars Minor, the Franciscans. That resulted in Giuliano, the future pope, being given to the Franciscans for his education at Perugia, culminating in priestly ordination. On the 9th of August, 1471, Uncle Francesco was elected Pope, Sixtus IV. The same year, Uncle Sixtus ordained nephew Giuliano as Bishop of Carpentras and made him Cardinal of San Pietro in Vinculi, his St. Peter in Chains. Giuliano was 18 years old. He took a mistress as cardinal and fathered at least 3 daughters. Cardinal Giuliano proved to be energetic and very talented. In a number of capacities. He was fluent in French and German, as well as his native Italian. Uncle Sixtus dispatched him as a papal legate on missions to France and Germany from 1481 to 1483. After Uncle Sixtus died in 1484, Cardinal Giuliano served as a trusted advisor to the next pope, Pope Innocent VIII. As cardinal, he became enemies with Rodrigo Borgia. So when Borgia was elected Pope Alexander VI in 1492, whose life we just covered, Cardinal Giuliano found it prudent to leave Italy and avail himself of his mastery of the French language to live in France. Giuliano was not able to make it back for the first conclave of 1503, which elected the 26-day Pope Pius III. But he was there when Pius III died, so he attended the second conclave of 1503. He accepted election as the 216th Pope on the first day of the conclave, which happened to be All Saints' Day, 1503. As papal name, he chose to simply Latinize his own baptismal name, so he reigned for 9 years and 4 months as Pope Julius II. So Giuliano Julius. No. Waiting on his desk was notification of a royal decree from Spain dated May 20th, 1503, signed by Ferdinand and Isabel, stating guidelines for the evangelization of the indigenous people of the New World. This was only 11 years after Columbus stumbled onto what he believed, until his death, to be the outer fringes of China, India, and Japan. Nevertheless, it was clear that the indigenous people that they encountered had never heard of Christianity, which India, China, and Japan most certainly had. So a religious policy had to be established for dealing with them. The 1503 edict filled that need, stipulating that the indigenous people should be separated from the Europeans to protect them from abuse and bad moral example. It stipulated the establishment of hospitals for the Spaniards as well as the indigenous people, kept separate, and stipulated the establishment of schools for the literary and religious instruction of the indigenous people. All three objectives were intended to be accomplished by employing the model of the European village parish church, staffed by mendicant friars, initially Franciscan, but soon afterward Dominicans and Augustinians as well. In the literature, if you read about the colonial period in the Americas, sometimes the books, the histories, will just leave it with the Spanish terms. So one is the congregación, a second form is the reduction, a third term is the doctrina. They each, variations on that idea of a village with a parish church and a school. Though well-intentioned, the European village model did not take into account the cultures and the environment of the New World. This approach worked reasonably well in areas with stable residence patterns, such as Mexico when the Spaniards first found it, explored it. But this pattern proved to be disastrous in the Caribbean islands, as well as in many parts of North America, where the residential pattern was migratory, meaning each season they moved to live in a different area, so they did not exhaust the food supply. So they'd spend one season in one place, then another season go somewhere else, so that the animals that could be replenished instead of just eating everything and then starving. To the European missionaries, who were coming from places where a village might have been in the same place since the Roman Empire, seasonal migration indicated barbarism. But in fact, it was just the result of generational experience in that environment, of the availability of food and water sources. When the European colonist, used the military to corral such tribes into European-style village parishes, the rhythms of tribal life were disrupted. The tribal sense of identity was ultimately lost, well, maybe not completely lost, but was certainly eroded. And the close quarters facilitated the spread of European diseases, to which the natives had no natural immunity. Christopher Columbus returned from his fourth and final voyage to the New World on the 7th of November, 1504. He wrote a letter to his patron, Queen Isabel of Castile, but she was too ill to respond. And he didn't know that at the time, but she died a month later on November 26th, 1504. In the same year, 1504, Pope Julius II attempted to establish an ecclesiastical organization for the new discoveries. King Ferdinand, now without Isabel, who was always friendly to the church, always supportive, as we saw last time with her support for Cardinal Jimenez. Now Ferdinand is kind of adrift, and he peremptorily informed Pope Julius that the only way any clergy were going to get to the New World was aboard his ships. That being the case, Ferdinand would only transport them if he approved papal policy in advance. King Ferdinand demanded the right, again, and if you read the histories, often they'll just leave it in the Spanish term, the patronato real, or the royal patronage, in return for financial support and military support required to establish the church in the New World. Having no alternative, he did have the alternative would be just to be excluded from the New World, which that wasn't acceptable. So Pope Julius just had to swallow it. And in 1508, he issued the papal bull Universalis Ecclesiae, which granted to the Spanish crown control over the Ternae. All right, so Ternae, that's a Latin term, Ternae. The way the practice developed is that for the positions of bishop and archbishop, it wasn't always, an ordinary form that developed in Europe in places that had cathedral chapters. Would be that when a vacancy appeared, then the chapter would generate a list of three names, hence Ternae, three names, and in order of preference. And then send that to the primate of the country, and then the primate would forward that to Rome with his recommendations. Now, the Pope is never obliged, to pick a name from that list, but more often than not, certainly over half of the time, they would just pick a name from that list. So here in the New World, part of the Patronato Real is that the Spanish crown would have control over the Ternae. So the cathedral chapter would generate the names. Then it would go to the Spanish Colonial Council, the Royal Council. Then it would go to the primate of the country. And then it would go to the Pope. So it would get filtered that way. And, of course, it could be edited, before it got to the primate or got to the Pope. So it's a tremendous authority that was being granted to the royal, to the crown over the new discoveries. A degree of authority that that monarchs in Europe didn't even enjoy to that extent. In the same 4-year period, 1504 to 1508, Pope Julius II was engaged in regaining control of the Papal States from Venice and other unscrupulous cities, which had availed themselves of the French invasion of 1494 to steal land from the church in that situation of chaos. The presence of sin and demonic manipulation of temptation meant that the territory could only be retaken by force. In 1508, Julius had reasserted papal control over the Romagna, and then made peace with Venice, because his long-term project was to drive the Turks, the Muslims, the Ottoman Turks, from Christian lands. And Venetian ships were needed. So remember last time we saw the Well, anyway, I'll leave it at that. So basically another crusade. Let's see if we... Yeah, okay. All right. Where is the... Yeah, okay. So... all right, so here's Italy. All right, so you see Rome right there. And then up to this side. So from Rome on a diagonal to the other side of the coast, that's where the Papal State was, in central Italy. North of the Papal State was Tuscany, where Florence is. North of Tuscany was Lombardy, where Milan is. And then Venice was on the coast. And then south was the Kingdom of Naples, which also controlled the island of Sicily off the coast. So to kind of geographically orient there. In 1505, Pope Julius II commissioned Michelangelo Buonarati to create a tomb for himself, for Julius. And it was going to be, the idea was that it would be placed in St. Peter's Basilica. It was to be a 3-level structure with a look like a ziggurat almost. So like a pyramidal, not a complete pyramid, but like an ascending and then they'd have a ramp going up, loop spiraling up, and on the ramp going up there would be 40. The plan was to have 40 statues. Now, after Julius died, the design was modified to the point that it was never completed because it was just too expensive. However, I'm mentioning it because in the 1520s, in pursuit of this project, Michelangelo carved a statue, a sculpture called the Genius of Victory, and 4 other statues that he never finished. They're called either the Slaves or the Prisoners. And they're valuable in the history of studying sculpture because he didn't finish them. So you could see part of it, and looking at the pictures of, for copyright reasons, I can't, because I don't know what YouTube would let us do, but it looks like they're struggling to get out of the rock. That's what, that's why they're called the prisoners. Anyway, they are. You can check out the website. They're in the Academy in Florence, a museum, the Accademia in Florence. In 1545, a funerary monument to Julius II was installed in the church of San Pietro in Vincoli, St. Peter in Chains. The church is still there. And this funerary monument is also still there. It's against one of the walls. There can be seen other sculptures that Michelangelo did that were intended for the tomb. The most famous being the Moses, Michelangelo's Moses. It's huge. Along with another, it's not quite as famous as the Moses, but it's part of the same group, his Rachel and Leah, the 2 sisters from that Jacob married in the Old Testament. As it turned out, Pope Julius's remains are not even there. He was interred later in St. Peter's Basilica next to his uncle, Pope Sixtus IV. But those statues, the Moses, the Rachel, the Leah, are in St. Peter in Chains Church in Rome, and then the others carved for the project are in a museum in Florence. Pope Julius II commissioned some of the most famous works in religious art in Western history. In 1505, he announced his intention to tear down St. Peter's Basilica and replace it with a new basilica. Now, the St. Peter's we're going to tear down. We first visited in the patristics course, the very first course you had with me, donated by the Emperor Constantine the Great, 1,200 years earlier. So he was going to tear it down and build a better one in its place. That's just the kind of person Julius was. Old St. Peter's had been constructed between 319 and 333 A.D. Designed with a basilica floor plan. That's so the basic, it was a cruciform shape, but the central aisle would be a longitudinal rectangle, 340 feet long, with the entrance door at one end and the sanctuary at the other end, where the altar was. And it was internally divided into three aisles. So you had the central aisle, and that was flanked by columns on each side, and then side aisles between those columns and the outside walls. Those columns held up a central section that was higher than the two sides, called the clerestory, because that was standard Roman practice, because that could then be pierced with windows to allow in light and ventilation. I hit this thing. It is okay. I'm sorry, having a technical thing here. Okay. There was a square colonnaded atrium outside, enclosed in an open-air courtyard in the front. And again, that was standard Roman. That was Roman architecture. By the reign of Julius II, its structural condition was unsafe. An extensive restoration was essential. It was just going to start collapsing. But Julius decided instead to just tear it down and start fresh. He commissioned as its first architect Donato Bramante, Bramante, from Urbino, Urbino. And Julius personally laid the cornerstone on April 18th, 1506. Bramante's design was going to be different from the Roman design and different from what's there now. His plan was for a Greek cross rather than a Latin cross. So, let's see. No, the Latin cross is the one where the four sides are not equal. So the center is longer, and then the side. Whereas the Greek cross, all four bars, all four are of equal length. So in other words, a Greek cross could fit inside of an equilateral square, whereas the Latin cross would not. The Latin cross would have to go into a rectangular square. He intended it would be a Greek cross, and then where they intersect, he was going to put a dome on top of it. So it was going to be designed like Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. The design after Bramante was changed several times after his death. And by the time St. Peter's was dedicated, 120 years later, on November 18th, 1626, it would be what's there now, which is a Latin cross shape, with the nave, the central part longer than the transepts, the sides. Though it did still have a dome at the intersection. But the dome is not a Greek dome. It's a different dome. But there's some engineering developments that have to happen before they could even figure out how to do that. And the one that's there now, is much bigger than even Constantine's. It's in length, it's 730 feet long, 501 feet wide. The height is now that's to the ceiling, not the top of the dome. The height to the ceiling is 452 feet. The dome, the diameter of the dome is 138 feet, and the seating capacity is 60,000. So, so that's going on in the background for the next 120 years. That's the construction's going to be going on. And later, we get to the reign of Pope Urban VIII. He's the one that got to dedicate it. In the year 1505, the Holy Roman Empire, which we've had occasion to visit many times in the medieval course, now we visit it again. In 1505, the Holy Roman Emperor was a Habsburg, Maximilian I von Habsburg. He began an attempt to transform the Holy Roman Empire into a universal Habsburg monarchy to ensure that the Habsburgs would always hold the position. He did that just as Henry VII in England was centralizing royal control. They all, the monarchs in the early modern period, all of them, France is going to do it, Spain, later Portugal. They want to erode the power of the aristocracy, of the secular, of the nobility, feudalism, in other words, and centralize authority with the monarch. In the same year, 1505, Martin Luther entered an Augustinian priory in Erfurt, Germany, Erfurt. So now we have to introduce him. So this, in church history, the early modern period was consumed largely with the Protestant movement. And it started with Martin Luther. So Martin Luther was born on the feast of St. Martin of Tours, November 10th, 1483, in the town of Eisleben in the Duchy of Saxony. He was named after Martin, after the saint of his birthday. His father, Hans Luder, Luder, had started life as a copper miner. His mother, her name was Margaret, her family's maiden name was Lindemann. Hans, Martin's father, proved to have a talent for business, so he worked his way out of the mine to become an owner. By the time Martin was an adult, Hans owned shares in 6 copper mines and 2 metal foundries. So attempting a vertical integration to not only get the raw materials but also process them for market. Martin was raised in an atmosphere that today would be characterized as domestic violence, with routine punishments for just ordinary, kid stuff, being so severe that they resulted in bleeding. Now, he was not the only one. Even those who were illiterate knew from sermons the verses from the book of Proverbs used to justify corporal punishment of children. Proverbs chapter 13, verse 24. Whoever spares the rod... Excuse me. I'm sorry about that. The tree of pain has many branches. The wheel of pain has many spokes. All right. Speaking of which, okay, so we were talking about the biblical foundation that people use to justify corporal punishment of children. So Proverbs chapter 13, verse 24, whoever spares the rod, that one. Proverbs chapter 22, verse 15. Foolishness is bound in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction shall drive it far from him. And Proverbs chapter 23, verse 14. Thou shalt beat them with the rod, and you will save them from hell. Anyway, so all of this was used as an excuse for sadism by those who were so inclined, and Martin Luther suffered a great deal because of it. The long-term spiritual damage was that he was afflicted for the rest of his life with scrupulosity and was subject to fits of uncontrollable rage. Now, whether there was a causal connection between the abuse, the domestic violence in his family of origin and these behavior patterns, can't be established with certainty, but it's worth remembering. Okay, so time passed. 1497, Luther began the Trivium and Quadrivium, the basic education, which we introduced in the patristics course. He studied with the Brethren of the Common Life in Magdeburg and Eisenach. That brought him into contact with Northern humanism, with its anti-authoritarianism, individualistic piety, and promotion of vernacular language. In 1501, at the age of 18, Luther was sent to the University of Erfurt, E-R-F-U-R-T. It's 110 miles north of Nuremberg, 140 miles southwest of Berlin, with the intention that he would obtain a doctorate of law in order to assist the family business. At least that was Hans's idea for his son Martin. And Martin did prove to be an excellent student. He received the Master of Arts with honors in 1505, and then, obediently to his father, of whom he was terrified, he enrolled in law school. And then something happened. On July 2nd, 1505, and this is Luther's account himself, he was walking back home from the university when a sudden thunderstorm erupted around him near Stotternheim. A bolt of lightning incinerated a nearby tree, and he took cover. According to his own later account, he was petrified that he might die without confession, and which in his mind he believed he had unconfessed mortal sins, so that would mean eternal damnation. So he prayed to St. Anne and promised that if she saved him, he would become a monk. He did survive. And 15 days later, Luther enraged his father by entering the Erfurt Priory of the Order of the Hermits Friar of St. Augustine, the Augustinians, on July 17th, 1505. 2 years later, he was ordained a priest. Those seminarians, how you like that? No 12 years of formation, just go from nothing at all, no religious training at all, and then 2 years later a priest. It's part of the feudalism problem. He was ordained a priest on April 3rd, 1507, in the Church of Our Lady in Erfurt. The Augustinian community existed as a result of an intervention by Pope Alexander IV in 1256, forcibly by papal edict, combining a number of previously distinct communities, religious communities, under a single governance and discipline, specifically the Augustinian rule, based on letter 211 in St. Augustine's collection, as well as based on description in the life of St. Augustine, the Vita of St. Augustine, written by Posidonius, who knew Augustine, specifically chapters 22 through 26 of that Vita. Because of the generalized nature of their origin, the Augustinians engaged in a variety of apostolates. In his decade, his 10 years as an Augustinian priest, Luther engaged in parish work, which included sacramental service, preaching, and teaching. In 1508, the Augustinians sent him to the new University of Wittenberg in Saxony. It was established in 1502, and so this is 6 years later. It was small, only had a student body of 167. Still, Luther was a good student, and he was looked to as a natural leader. Let's see. All right. So there's Wittenberg, and you see Magdeburg up to the north. So that's we're in Germany. he quickly developed at the university an aversion to scholasticism, scholastic theology. And remember from the medieval course, the scholastic method, ideally, was designed to train the mind in a set procedure for arriving at the truth. That's very arduous. And by summarizing contrary opinions and phrasing the contrary arguments in the strongest possible terms. Then second, refuting them. Third, making an assertion buttressed by a recognized authority. Saying, oh, well, so the gospel says this, or Augustine says this, or Peter Lombard says that. Then fourth, offering a multi-layered defense of that assertion. And then fifth, addressing and disposing of all of the previously summarized contrary opinions. This requires patience. It takes time and effort that is beyond the willingness of most people. To just don't have the patience for that. I really just don't see the point. And Luther was one of those. He was an excellent student, but this kind of thing it just seemed pointless, wasted effort to him. And his threshold of patience was very limited. Moreover, by Luther's time, scholastic theology was taught. It was simply imposed as a task of lengthy memorization of all of this. So you'd memorize the positions, the set contras, the conclusions. So you just memorize it and then just repeat it to prove to your professors that you had studied it, which is not what the method was intended. The method was intended to go through step by step, to think your way through each position. So the first, even when you start, the contrary, the opposing opinions, you think about it enough to be able to phrase them in the strongest possible terms. And then think your way through the whole process. Because that's the whole point, is training a pattern of thought, a habit of mind, as a way to arrive at the truth. So just saying, just assigning to the students, okay, here are these, memorize these 50 said contras and memorize the refutation and the conclusions and all of that. Okay, a good student can do that. Just as, you can give them a page of the phone book to memorize, and a good student will figure out a way how to do that. But then once the exam is over, then it's gone. They instantly forget. And Luther understood that. They just felt that it was wasted effort. This was even harder in Luther's case, not only because he didn't have the patience, but because it was a different approach from his earlier schooling with the Brethren of the Common Life, who used only vernacular writings in their teaching, instead of here's a take this from the Summa of Duns Scotus and just memorize it, but and the Brethren, not only was it vernacular, but they chose writings that were edifying, that were tailored to a subjective spirituality that he found meaningful. By contrast, Luther described scholastic theology as a, quote, waiting for the real thing. And for him, the real thing was study of Scripture. He said, why spend all this time memorizing what Sigera Brabant said? Instead, I'd rather spend this time memorizing Scripture in the Bible. In the university library, Luther found and read source material from the previous century that were anti-authoritarian. They started as anti-papal, but then as with this, anti-church authority, but then it expanded into anti-secular authority as well. Against feudalism, against aristocracy, and not yet, but it would lay the foundation for what later developed as anti-monarchy. So these authors were Marsilius of Padua, whom we covered in the 14th century, Dante Alighieri, who's best known for the Divine Comedy, but also wrote De Monarchia, William of Ockham, and John of Paris, and Jean Girson, all of whom we covered earlier in the 14th century. Third, fourth. And reading these guys who were condemned, at least Marsilius of Padua and William of Ockham were condemned by the church already. So reading these guys shaped Luther's ecclesiology and predisposed him to anti-authoritarianism, and initially against the church, and anti-clericalism. Even while he was still a cleric, he was a friar, he was a mendicant, an ordained priest. In addition, in the library, he had access to the works of the church fathers, and especially St. Augustine made an impression on him. And Augustine, if you remember from Patristics, was forced by necessity to refute many heresies of antiquity. And because of the particular nature of those heresies, such as Pelagianism and Donatism, St. Augustine's responses dealt extensively with the complexities of the theology of grace. On the intellectual level, Luther rejected the basic philosophical supposition of high medieval scholastics like Aquinas, which was realism. You remember we talked about that the realism versus the nominalism. The William of Champeau was the sort of the progenitor of the scholastic realist school, as opposed to the nominalist. So, and people like Aquinas were realists. They believed in a metaphysics that first something beyond the physical does exist, and that in that realm there is objective truth beyond the physical reality, meaning there is an objective good and true and beautiful, virtue and vice, grace, the church. That all of those are objective realities that exist beyond the physical, because they flow from eternal concepts in the mind of God. Luther, on the other hand, embraced the alternative, the rival school of thought, also derived from the earlier medieval university context, called nominalism, which we've encountered many times, derived from the Latin word nomina, meaning name. And that is a defective metaphysics which dismisses the idea of universal concepts or universal truth in one of two ways. Either they rejected the existence of such things, or they'll say even if there is some objective truth in some non-temporal, non-spatial realm, we are not equipped to access it. So all we can do is assign names. We can use names like goodness, truth, and beauty, right and wrong, virtue and vice, church. So we can use names for all of that. But those are just terms of convenience. We cannot say that there is only one good, always and everywhere, to be the case. Whereas a realist would say, yes, there is. And it's been revealed to us. Therefore, we can know it. So those two positions really are not reconcilable. So Luther embraced the nominalism. This decision on his part rendered, anyone, not just him, and as we covered when we first introduced nominalism in the early Middle Ages, this nominalism renders one incapable of accepting the transcendent element of aspects of our faith, such as sacraments, as being a conduit of grace from the supernatural to the natural order. Because that's all based on eternal concepts, universal concepts, which nominalism rejects. On the spiritual level, Luther arrived at the Augustinian priory already afflicted with scrupulosity because of the because of the way he. Well, I mean, I assume that because of the way he was raised, because nothing just happens. So I mean, I refuse to. I know sometimes we overly psychologize things, but it is beyond belief that a child could grow up being routinely disciplined for childhood offenses with beatings that result in bleeding, and not be affected by that. And the spiritual dynamic of scrupulosity, which we talked about in the section on St. Anselm in the medieval course, scrupulosity revolves around a core of subjectivity and hyper-emotionalism. So a person afflicted this way, it feeds in it, so that a person afflicted this way always thinks that they are guilty of something, that they're sinful, that they've done something wrong. Well, a realist, a correct Catholic metaphysics, said that there is an objective criteria for that. Did you really commit this sin? And if you did, is it a mortal sin, a venial sin? So there is an objective criteria for that. But scrupulosity, because of the hyper-emotional state of fear and anxiety and worry, they tend to see things and interpret things as mortally sinful in a more serious way than the church would, because it's all subjective. It's not objective. So they don't have a reference. So yes, okay, there's these criteria. There's the act, the intention, the circumstance, the matter. There's all. So they just don't follow that criteria, which is the standard Catholic moral criteria. But instead, it's just the emotional state of feeling worthless and sinful. So in Luther, he already arrived at the Augustinians feeling that way. So in Luther, this merged with this nominalism, with this predisposition to self-loathing, the life experience of domestic violence, brutality inflicted on him, all of which gave him an image of God limited to the Old Testament stories of God as vengeful. The vengeful, punishing God made complete sense to him. The result left Luther in a state of almost continual panic that he could not possibly get to heaven, that he was so worthless and so sinful that he was doomed. Meaning that studying the theology of grace by reading St. Augustine was not a mere intellectual exercise for Luther. It was a life preserver. He desperately wanted to find a solution to the spiritual torment of scrupulosity and his fear of eternal damnation. Now, as when we covered St. Anselm, who was also afflicted that way, he was fortunate that he had, that he had a Lanfranc of Beck was his spiritual director, who helped him through that, gave him a way. There's really no cure for scrupulosity, but there is a treatment, so to speak. But there's a methodology by which one can cope with it. But Luther didn't have that. Instead, and he didn't even think to look, because all he was getting in the university, well, here, memorize these 50 questions, from this guy's Summa. All right, you've done that. Okay, here's another Summa. Memorize another 50, and so it didn't really seem like there was any connection between his spiritual needs and what he was learning. And so there's more that idea of waste. I'm wasting my time, wasting my life. So during the Wittenberg period, 1508 to 1512, Luther began developing what was later used as a foundation of the Lutheran movement, justification by faith alone, often abbreviated sola fide, faith alone. Years later, he explained to his son, and yes, I'm anticipating, but he eventually did leave the priesthood and he got married, and had a family. So years later, he explained to his son that the insight came to him while reading St. Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 1, verse 17, which reads, quote, "The just shall live by faith," end quote. So the word translated as just, remember the New Testament was written in Greek, so the word translated as just was the Greek word dikaio, which has a broader meaning. It means like vindicate, acquit of a charge, or someone is vindicated, or pronounce righteous. So just is one. It's a legitimate translation of the word dikaio, but righteous, properly understood, encompasses the broader meaning. Righteous in the sense of a right relationship between God and human beings. So, using that, so the quote translated that way would be, "The righteous shall live by faith," or those in a right relationship with God will live by faith. Now, Luther's use of this passage reveals to us the emerging Protestant hermeneutic. So the hermeneutic just means a method of interpretation. And for Luther and then for the later Protestant movement, it would be a subjective hermeneutic, rooted in nominalism. Whereas the Catholic, metaphysics is the realist, is the objective metaphysics that we, have reference to, the authority of the Church making true statements on matters of faith and morals. Whereas the emerging Protestant hermeneutic is different, is subjective, based on an individual's experience. But you see, nothing just happens. There's a reason for that, and it goes back to this way, to Luther's education, that he had these spiritual needs. He was forced to do this intense study, but the two didn't come together. That he felt that the authority of the university and the church was wasting his time and making him study things that were not relevant, that were not helping him in his spiritual needs. So as his hermeneutic, his interpretive paradigm developed, and then from him the general Protestant movement, the subjectivism, it developed a spirit of opposition to established authority, the Pope and the magisterium. And this hermeneutic of opposition included a presumption of dishonesty and uselessness on the part of the church magisterium. And we'll have some quotes from his later writing to show I did that. He just assumed that everything they said was either useless, just because of its nature of being useless, or it was deliberately wrong for the sake of manipulation and control. And that means there's no trust. So right at the beginning, if there's no trust, it's no wonder that he ended up leaving the church. The second element of this emerging subjective hermeneutic, the Protestant hermeneutic, is reducing an issue to the false choice. It's either one or two things, either faith alone or works alone, and then choosing, faith alone. Whereas that's not the Catholic way. It's faith and works. Third element is an anthropology. Anthropology, anthropos is human man in the sense of human beings. It's a theology, the doctrine of humanity, the doctrine of being human, and it flowed from a residue of dualism that has remained ambient in Europe. We covered the ancient stuff and the patristics, but then we saw in the medieval course how Byzantine iconoclasm, and those people were expelled from the empire, and then they followed the Black Sea up the western coast of the Black Sea to where the Danube River enters into it, debarked there and set up life there in southeastern Europe. And the Danube is a trade route so it followed the trade routes into Europe, the dualist, the Bogomilism, the Cathar movement, the Albigensians, the Bohemian Hussites. Such that, remember, dualism, this is the origin of the Protestant doctrine of humanity, their belief in the total depravity of the human person. Or as Luther would say, that even our good works, even when we try to do good works, he dismissed that as dirty rags. was his phrase. It's just dirty rags that must be cloaked over by the merits of Christ. And that's dualism. Because we're physical beings, so we're worthless. Now, that's not the Catholic anthropology, as we've seen. Is if we refer to the book of Genesis. Well, anyway, I'll get to that. I think I'm going to summarize the thing on the grace later. Paradoxically, another effect of the influence of dualism is alongside belief in the total depravity of humanity. That it was the belief, was internalization of the Renaissance exaltation of man as the measure of all things, manifested as a version of semi-Pelagianism, which held that the initial act of faith is in the control of the free will. So again, subjective, it's the individual free will. And then we need God's grace to be saved. So it's a completely personalized and subjective view of the magisterium, of teaching, of authority and doctrine. Intentionally so. I mean, that's not a problem for them. That's just the view. So where Luther asserted sola scriptura, Scripture alone, that all creation must be placed beneath the authority of Scripture. But then, how is Scripture interpreted? For him, it's not interpreted by the church magisterium. It's the individual conscience. So again, the subjectivism, the personalism. So everything's beneath Scripture, but it's the individual conscience that interprets Scripture. And that individual conscience is shaped by the individual's relationship with God, not mediated through a church hierarchy. From his other studies, and just interacting with students, Luther internalized the emerging nationalism of Europe, in particular the Hussites, the Bohemian Hussites, who we talked about, that Bohemia is the present-day Czech Republic, and they were the first to attempt an emancipation from the Holy Roman Empire, which was controlled by Germans, whereas they're Czechs. I mean, they're different. It's a different ethnic group. So they wanted their own. They wanted, national self-determination, as it would be called later. They fought 3 wars. They were crushed unmercifully each time, so they failed. And it became Switzerland was the first one, which we covered previously, was the first one to successfully secede from the empire. But this idea of nationalism fed into political nationalism, as well as this ecclesiology of the individual repudiating international authority like the church merged. Okay, now I'm going to do an excursus on the theology of grace, the Catholic theology of grace, because that is going to be an issue in things that we talk about. And remember, we have to cover both history and theology, which means we never get to cover as much as we want, but we have to at least try. So the Catholic metaphysics, Catholic theology, it always begins from the top down. So we start with the divinity, which is revealed to us as Trinity, and then work our way down. So we begin with the supernatural order, metaphysics. The mystery of the Trinity, our theology of that is summarized in the Catechism, paragraph numbers 257 through 260. The nature of this Trinitarian God is love. And it is the nature of love to reach out, to seek communion, to seek to share. So God is certainly not forced to do anything, but it just flows from the nature of perfect love. It flows from the nature of love to reach out, and perfect love is going to reach out. So that love combined with the omnipotence, the limitless power of God, results in creation. Catechism 257, quote, God freely wills to communicate the glory of his blessed life. Such is the plan of his loving kindness, conceived by the Father before the foundation of the world. End quote. So the result of that, just the nature, Nobody forced God to create, but it's the nature of his love, his perfect love, combined with unlimited power, resulted in the act of creation. Which brings us to Catechism number 302. Creation, quote, creation has its own goodness and proper perfection. See, that's opposite of dualism, but anyway, proper perfection. But it did not spring forth complete from the hands of the Creator. The universe was created in a state of journeying toward an ultimate perfection yet to be attained, to which God has destined it. We call divine providence the dispositions by which God guides his creation toward this perfection. Okay, so repudiating dualism, creation is good. Even the material universe, by its nature, is good because it was created by God out of love. But the natural law of that creation includes the process of growth. So it was not it wasn't just a snapshot that stopped. Part of the natural law of that creation is like we grow. We grow from the embryo to an adult. The tree from the seed, the seed to the tree, the egg to the bird. I mean, but that's part of the natural. That doesn't mean that God left something out or that it was incomplete in the sense of being imperfect, but rather the nature of what he created. It was created out of love with this idea of continual growth, including us. So we, male and female, were created in the image of God. Again, it's totally opposite of dualism. Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. This is quoting God. Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, etc. God created man in his image, and the divine image he created him, male and female. He created them. This means that from the moment we came into being, prior to any question of original sin or the fall, we contain grace, which means the gift of God's creative power in the image of the divinity that we call the soul. All right, so you can read some more about that prior to the fall. The Catechism numbers 374 to 379. For the sake of time, I won't read all of it. So, moving on. Catechism 280. Creation is the foundation of all God's saving plan that culminates in Christ. And the mystery of Christ casts conclusive light on the mystery of creation and reveals the end for which God willed it to come into being. End quote. Okay. Now, so then what happened? Well, this original harmony was damaged by sin, by the disobedience of Adam and Eve. As part of that creation, part of God creating us out of love included free will, which means we're free to be stupid. We're free to sin. And that's what they did. Specifically, they sinned, they surrendered to the temptation of mistrusting God and replacing trust of God with pride, and the nature of that act, the nature of the act to surrender to pride, manifested externally as an act of disobedience. And that's summarized in Genesis chapter 3, introducing original sin into the human condition. In Genesis 3, God lists a series of punishments. You work by the sweat of your brow, childbirth will be painful, death, physical death. But in the list of consequences, which are pretty scary, God does not say that you are no longer made in the image and likeness of God. I am no longer going to make human beings in that image. It doesn't say that. So that wasn't changed. Meaning human nature and creation were harmed by sin, disobedience, but not destroyed. In the natural order, this weakening, this harming, caused by original sin leaves us with spiritual and moral vulnerabilities that are summarized in the first letter of St. John, chapter 2, verse 16, as the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and pride of life, addressed in the Catechism, number 2514. I won't read all, but it refers to, I'll give you some scripture passages. You'll have to track them down on your own. First letter of Timothy, chapter 6, verses 3 to 5. It talks about those who teach differently, which, the heresy, basically, that those who choose, heresane means choice, who choose something to teach something differently. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 9 through 10 on greed, the danger of greed. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 2 through 5 is on hypocrisy and how that can manifest in the church, how that damages the community of the church, even those who are intentionally trying to repair the damage. That hypocrisy, the two-face, the damage that does. So you read that. Letter of James, chapter 3, verses 6 through 10, is on the damage done by the tongue, our speech, how we misuse our faculty of speech. So you can read all those on your own. Now, with that background, the Catholic term for this instability of our moral faculties, constantly weakened and constantly subject to temptation, is concupiscence, derived from the Latin verb cupere, meaning to desire. Now, not all desire is bad. We desire to get to heaven. That's not bad. But when used in this context, concupiscence refers to that vulnerability to temptation, to sin, the temptation, a vulnerability to the temptation to sin. So we're not doomed. We don't have to sin, but we are vulnerable to the desire to sin. All right, you refresh your memories. Catechism number 2515. The presence of this sin raises obvious questions in the light of the omnipotence of God. Why does evil exist? If God is all-powerful and all good, could God just not erase it? Well, okay. The Catechism addresses this in Numbers 309 through 314. Within that section, we'll give a quote from Catechism number 311. Quote, "Angels and men." Now, this is men capitalized, so, obviously it's men and women, it's human beings, but the text says angels and men, as intelligent and free creatures, have to journey toward their ultimate destinies by their free choice and preferential love. They can, therefore, go astray. God permits it, however, because he respects the freedom of his creatures and mysteriously knows how to derive good from it. In that section, there's then a block quote from Augustine, a work called the Enchiridion, chapter 3, section 11, quote, "For Almighty God, because he is supremely good, would never allow any evil whatsoever to exist in his works if he were not so all-powerful and good as to cause good to emerge from it." The next paragraph, Catechism 312, quotes from the book of Genesis, chapter 50, verses 15 through 22. This is from the Old Testament Joseph, the son of Jacob, the one whose brothers sold him into slavery. And, and then later he managed to survive and thrive, through God's help. And later was in a position of power. And when a famine hit the land, he used that power to welcome the family into Egypt, but his father was still alive. So this passage from Genesis 50 is after his father's dead, and the brothers are worried. They think, okay, maybe he just helped us because of Dad, but now that Dad's gone, he's going to get payback for what we did to him. So that's their guilty conscience talking. So this passage, Joseph tells them, don't have any fear. You meant it for evil, but God turned it to good. Now that's a level of detachment, I certainly have never and will never reach. But again, I'm not the source of, it's the church. So that this is the church's teaching based on this biblical passage, in part on this and as well as others, to address that. Okay, so all that's the natural order, the effects of sin on the natural order. Now the supernatural order, as we saw, then Genesis 3, does not tell us that we have ceased being made in the image and likeness of God as a result of original sin. So that would have required extermination and recreation as something else. He does not say we are no longer human beings. He does not say we are no longer made in his image and likeness. So this preserved condition of being made in God's image enables us to receive sanctifying grace, defined as a supernatural disposition. So you see, from the metaphysical to the physical, from the supernatural to the natural, a supernatural disposition that enables the soul to live with God and act by the love of God. As part of our nature, as made in the image and likeness of God, we can still receive this grace from the supernatural order, and we can use it to do good in the world. All right, Catechism number 2000 on sanctifying grace, and that is within a longer section, numbers 1996 through 2005 on grace. Okay. The persistence of the supernatural aspect of our creation means that grace, the gift of God's creative act, remains. This supernatural character explains the various forms of what in Catholic tradition is called the preparation for the gospel. It's capitalized, it's a proper term, and preparation for the reception of grace. So the presence of grace within us as being created in the image and likeness of God makes it possible for us to receive grace and do good in the world. Sample biblical foundation for this. Remember that, so Catholic teaching is always Scripture and tradition. So tradition is always based on Scripture. In this case, Ephesians, St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, chapter 2, verse 10, quote, "For we are his workmanship, created in Jesus Christ for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them." From that, the Catechism summarizes about preparation for the reception of grace being the work of grace in number 2001. Okay, the combination of our awareness of the supernatural along with our vulnerability to temptation as a result of original sin has rendered the human person subject to many errors. So again, we're not destroyed, we're not ruined, but we are vulnerable, and part of that is being subject to error. Some of these errors being the result of demonic manipulation and temptation. As you know, the serpent tempted Adam and Eve. Satan tempted Jesus in the desert. And we also are always tempted. But he cannot force us because we have free will. That cannot be taken away from us. We can misuse it, but it can't be taken away from us. And there's a whole list of errors we covered since the Patristic Discourse, pre-Christian errors such as dualism and pantheism and paganism, superstition, idolatry, magic. We covered all of that. Now Jesus offers us a striking teaching on the continuing interference of Satan in our lives. The Gospel of John, chapter 8, verses 43 and 44. In speaking to those who claimed to be children of Abraham, but who refused to believe in Jesus. And Jesus says, quote, "Why do you not understand what I say? It is because you cannot bear to hear my word. You are of your father, the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and has nothing to do with the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks according to his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies. End quote. Can't get clearer than that. And of course, Satan tempted Jesus, recorded in, for example, in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 4, verses 1 through 11. And Jesus, and he continues to tempt us, but Jesus showed us how to resist those temptations. One example of that being Jesus taught us how to pray. Matthew chapter 6. 2 chapters later, the final petition. He taught us how to say the Lord's Prayer 2 chapters after the temptation. The temptation, Matthew 4, the Lord's Prayer, chapter 6. And on the final petition of the Lord's Prayer, deliver us from evil, the Catechism number 2850 through 2854. Okay. All right, I think we got it. All right, with this foundation, the Catholic theology of justification. So Luther used that term, but again, it didn't just come out of nowhere. I mean, so that that is part of our tradition, but of course he interpreted it differently because of all the reasons we discussed. So the Catholic theology of justification is summarized in the Catechism number 1987. Quote, "The grace of the Holy Spirit has the power to justify us, that is, to cleanse us from our sins and to communicate to us the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ and through baptism. But if we have died with Christ, we believe," now this is in the Catechism passage, you see, it's always based on Scripture, is a quote from St. Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 6, verses 8 through 11. "But if we have died with Christ, we believe we should also live with him. For we know that Christ, being raised from the dead, will never die again. Death no longer has dominion over him. The death he died to sin, once and for all. But the life he lives to God. So you also must consider yourselves as dead to sin and alive to God in Jesus Christ." So just remember that. So righteousness, justification, righteousness, meaning right relationship. Okay. Catechism number 1990. So once we have this justification, this right relationship, what does that mean? Quote, "Justification detaches man from sin, which contradicts the love of God, and purifies his heart of sin. Justification follows upon God's merciful initiative of offering forgiveness. It reconciles man with God. It frees from the enslavement of sin, and it heals." Okay. So with that in mind, we're going to use justification is going to be an issue all the way up through the Council of Trent, which we'll cover in a future course. So back to the reign of Julius II. 1506, the year after Luther entered the Augustinians. Philip the Handsome, or Philip the Fair, whom we met earlier, he was the son of the Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. He died prematurely, and leaving behind his wife. Remember, he was married to a Spanish princess, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabel. Her name was Juana. Now, she's one of a great tragedy, a sad tragedy in Spanish history. She's called Juana the Mad. As after Philip died, she went insane, and it's not. I mean, it's not mocking. I mean, she had his embalmed corpse. Like, she would travel with it, in the coffin, and then, when at night she'd put it in her room and open it. I mean, it's a tragedy. Really, it was really sad what happened to her. So a council of regency was appointed to govern. It was led by Cardinal Jimenez, whom we've met, Jimenez y Cisneros. he was the regent until the son of Philip and Juana reached adulthood. And that guy we've also met briefly, Carlos, King Carlos in Spanish history, and Charles V. He's Carlos I in Spanish history, and Charles V in the history of the Holy Roman Empire. Okay, in May of 1508 through October of 1512, Michelangelo painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, commissioned by Pope Julius II. The Sistine Chapel is named for Pope Sixtus, Sistine Sixtus. Remember, Pope Sixtus IV was the uncle of Pope Julius II. So the building, the Sistine Chapel, was already there. It was just the chapel for the papal household. And it already had some decoration. It already had some frescoes along the walls, not the ceiling, but along the walls. And a few of them by Michelangelo's own maestro, his own master, who taught him Domenico Ghirlandaio. In 1508, Pope Julius commissioned Michelangelo to paint the ceiling with frescoes of the 12 apostles against a starry sky. Now, with Michelangelo's compulsive work habits, the complete opposite of Da Vinci, just that project, it would have probably just taken him a few months. But instead, Michelangelo, he was, if nothing else, a perfectionist as well as a workaholic. Instead, he worked on the ceiling for 4 years. The 12 apostles just wasn't enough. He painted 343 figures. On a curved surface, the ceiling is curved, 6,300 square feet, 58 feet high, using, remember the fresco method, that time-sensitive, that pressure fresco method. You have to get the paint in, the wet plaster before it dries. So the ceiling, he ditched the whole 12 Apostles theme, and instead it's designed around 9 scenes from the book of Genesis, with other biblical people and scenes in the rectangular perimeter just for decoration. So the scenes from the altar, so it's a chapel, you have an altar at one end, the entrance on the, so from the altar end, above the altar, toward the main door, it goes the separation of light and darkness, the creation of the sun, the moon, and the earth, the separation of land from water, the temptation and the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, the 3 was the separation of land and water, 4 the creation of Adam, 5 the creation of Eve, 6 was the expulsion, the temptation and the expulsion from Eden, 7 the sacrifice of Noah, 8 the great flood, 9 the drunkenness of Noah. It's noteworthy, in context of our periodic visits to Renaissance art, that this was the first time that art rendering the human form nude had been permitted inside of a church in Rome. The ceiling was cleaned and restored, which you may recall, depending on your age, between June of 1980 and December of 1989. It was paid for by the Japanese, and in exchange they got exclusive rights to do the documentary and the filming of it. But eventually it was open for the world, so they got first the exclusive, so to speak, the first exclusive. But then it was for all of us. Work continued restoring the wall frescoes, culminating in a ceremony of dedication by Saint John Paul II on April 8th, 1994. In his homily, he addressed that issue of nudity used within a church. So you have these 300 naked people above your head while Mass is going on. So he addressed that. His words, quote, "It seems that Michelangelo, in his own way, allowed himself to be guided by the evocative words of the book of Genesis, which, as regards the creation of the human being, male and female, reveals. The man and his wife were both naked, yet they felt no shame. The Sistine Chapel is precisely, if one may say so, the sanctuary of the theology of the human body. In witnessing to the beauty of man, created by God as male and female, it also expresses, in a certain way, the hope of a world transfigured, the world inaugurated by the risen Christ. All right, so that, end quote. So that was his homily on April 8th, 1994. And he was a pope then, and now is also a saint, so that's good enough for me. 1508, Julius issues another commission to another painter, Raphael of Urbino, to fresco his own apartments, Julius's own apartments. So his name, Raphael, is how he's best known, but his full name was Italian, of course. So Raffaello Sanzio da Urbino. Raphael was born on Good Friday, 1483. That year, Good Friday was March 28th. Father, Giovanni Santi. His mother's name was Magia. Giovanni, his father, was court painter to the Duke of Urbino. Urbino was small, but its court was highly cultured, and its leaders were patrons of literature and the arts. Federico de Montefeltro reigned as Duke of Urbino from 1444 to 1474. He began this transition of Urbino. I mean, Urbino existed, of course, before this, but he made it into a Renaissance court, so the patron of the arts, beginning when he became Duke in 44. This tradition was carried on, maintained by his son, Guidobaldo de Montefeltro, who was Duke of Urbino when Raphael was born. So he was Duke from 1482 to 1508. Duke Guidobaldo married Elisabetta Gonzaga. The House of Gonzaga, at the time, was in control of another highly cultured Renaissance court in the city of Mantua. She was the sister of the Marquis of Mantua, Francisco II Gonzaga. So she had so both Guidobaldo from his father and she from Mantua, they both were patrons of the arts. So meaning they're willing to spend money to pay artists to full time to produce literature, poetry, drama, plays, essays, painting, sculpture, music, all of the arts. In 1504, Elisabetta welcomed to Urbino a diplomat named Baldassare Castiglione. Castiglione. He was a count in his own right, the Count of Casaccio, and he wrote a famous book, which we'll talk about later, because it was published in 1528, called the Book of the Courtier. But it was based on these years of his life when he was in Urbino, and Raphael was also in Urbino. So his Book of the Courtier, about life and of cultured people, that tells us how Raphael was raised, because he was raised at the court too. His father was the court painter. So this is and everybody who wrote about Raphael later always commented on his impeccable manners and his, what we would say today is, his people skills, that he could get along with everyone. All of his students loved him, everybody. He just got along with people, in addition to having his other artistic gifts, and that's rooted in this kind of formation, this kind of training. So we'll summarize that later when the book was published, but sticking with Raphael. He had a very unhappy childhood. His mother died when he was 8. His father died when he was 11. His guardian then became his father's brother, his uncle, who happened to be a priest named Bartolomeo Sanzi. Bartolomeo apprenticed Raphael to a painter, Pietro Perugino. Perugino was from the region. He was from Umbria, the same region as Urbino, but he had done his apprenticeship in Florence under Andrea del Verrocchio. In that same workshop, Verrocchio also trained Domenico Ghirlandaio, and Ghirlandaio later trained Michelangelo. And when Perugino was in the workshop, Leonardo da Vinci was another apprentice. Anyway, so after his apprenticeship, Raphael was recognized as a maestro, as a master in his own right, by December of 1500, and he got a commission. And then, as all these guys, he had to start traveling, looking for commissions to work. And artists in this period, like at Verrocchio's workshop, even if they got known for a particular thing, like Raphael became known as a painter, they could not be limited that way. So they had to know how to build, how to do painting, how to sculpt, how to do metalwork. I mean, they had to be extremely versatile in order to make money and survive. Because, obviously Raphael was not independently wealthy. So he started traveling looking for commissions. And he did. He got one after another until he got a name. He got a reputation. The quality of his work earned him a reputation. Now, another person from Urbino was a guy we met already, Bramante of Urbino, who was the first architect of St. Peter's. So with Raphael's reputation, and, they're from the hometown, kid back home. So Bramante made the introductions in Rome in 1508. And that began a prolific time in his life, the rest of his life. He was extraordinarily prolific, like Michelangelo, and very much unlike Da Vinci. And the first commission he was given in Rome was given by Pope Julius in 1508, the same year that Julius commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine ceiling. Raphael's task was to fresco the Papal Apartments in the Vatican Palace. Now, Julius wanted his rooms to be more impressive than those of his hated rival, the late Pope Alexander VI. So Alexander, the Borgia Apartments, and this is all part of the Vatican Museum now. So if you get, well, I guess in COVID you can't, but if COVID ever goes away and you can start traveling again and you get to go to the Vatican museums, this is all, the Papal Palace is part of the museum. So the Borgia Apartments, Alexander's rooms, are on the second floor. So Julius made sure that his apartments were going to be on the floor above that, on the third floor, overlooking the courtyard of the Belvedere. Now, Alexander's apartments, the Borgia Apartments, had been frescoed by Pinturicchio from 1492 to 94. So Julius insisted that he had better frescoes than Alexander's rooms had, and Raphael delivered. The rooms are now part of the Vatican Museum. It's a series of four suites, and these paintings include some that you've probably seen, the School of Athens. And it's on a wall. It's not on a canvas. It's not an easel painting. It's on a wall. And Raphael put people. He did this. He put contemporary people in some of his paintings. So he put Michelangelo in there. He put himself in there. And then it's just they did that. And also the Disputa, which is the one that has the monstrance in the center. It's a Eucharistic thing. And these are considered, the Raphael rooms are considered, along with the Sistine ceiling, the pinnacle of large-scale Renaissance fresco art. Before the wars of religion, triggered by the Protestant movement, diverted resources away from such endeavors. All right, so all that started in 1508. Next year, 1509, on April 21st, King Henry VII of England died of tuberculosis at the age of 52. He died in Richmond Palace in Surrey, was buried in Westminster Abbey in London. His eldest surviving son became Henry VIII. Yes, the one who's going to take England out of the church. Henry VIII became the second Tudor king at the age of 18. He married his late brother Arthur's widow, Catherine of Aragon, 2 months later, on June 11th, 1509. Now, we met her already. Remember, she was a Spanish princess, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabel, so a younger sister of Juana. for the sake of an alliance. Again, this is the feudalism problem. Remember, so we focus, because this is teaching this in a seminary. We focus on the damage feudalism did to the sacrament of holy orders. Families sending kids into the church without a vocation, but it did the same damage to the sacrament of marriage. So, an alliance between two countries, that's not the reason for the sacrament of matrimony, yet that's how it was used. So she's a Spanish princess. Arthur was an English prince. So, okay, that's going to finalize the treaty. Well, Arthur died, as we saw, and a dispensation was granted so she could marry Arthur's younger brother, Henry. Henry was 18. Catherine was 23. Their marriage took place in a Franciscan church outside of Greenwich Palace, 7 years after the death of her first husband, Arthur. Marriage to Arthur's brother, Henry, could only take place if a papal dispensation was granted, because canon law prohibited a man from marrying his brother's widow. That's based on Leviticus chapter 18, verse 16. In order to obtain the dispensation, Catherine testified that her marriage to Arthur was never consummated because they got sick so soon. And he never did recover, and she was also sick. She eventually did. Meaning, so an unconsummated marriage in canon law is called a putative marriage. So it can be dissolved by the Pope. And that was done. A dispensation was granted by Pope Julius II in October of 1504. But then they waited, because Henry VII wasn't ready to marry her to Prince Henry VIII. He was stringing him along. He wanted more money out of the Spanish. And, so she just kind of had to hang around for years. And then after Henry VII died, then Henry VIII married her. 1511, 2 years later, the Diocese of Santo Domingo was established on the island of Hispaniola. Today, part of that island, the western third, is Haiti, the nation of Haiti, and the rest of it is the Dominican Republic. The first bishop, Diego de Padilla, died before his consecration. So the first resident bishop in the New World was an Italian missionary, Alessandro Heraldini. That's G-E-R-A-L-D-I-N-I. On the fourth Sunday of Advent, the same year, 1511, a Spanish Dominican missionary on the same island, named Antonio de Montesinos, mounted his pulpit and delivered a scathing denunciation of the Spanish colonists for their treatment of the indigenous people in the New World. Now, I won't read it all because I'm going to cover this in more detail in the fourth year course when we cover the history of Catholicism in the United States. So just know that's going on in the background. And he inspired Bartolomeo de las Casas, whom we'll also meet. He later became a bishop in Mexico. Okay, so that happened in 1511. But back in Europe in 1511, the French military and interest in Italy revived. French aggression against Italy revived, resulting in the French invasion of Italy and capture of the city of Bologna, which is part of the Papal state. And Julius, of course, he resisted. He was nearly captured. Not only lost the battle, lost the city, but almost lost his freedom. Managed to escape. King Charles VIII had died childless. The guy who invaded previously died in 1498. He was followed by his nephew, who became King Louis XII. Domestic disputes distracted King Louis XII from the Italian ambitions, but French garrisons remained scattered throughout Italy. And Louis did have legitimate dynastic claims on Italy, as did most of the other royal houses of Europe, because they all intermarried with each other. So when Louis XII finally felt free to turn his attention to Italy, he renewed the Gallican claims first asserted by the Pragmatic Sanction of Bruges in 1438 as an attack. We talked about this in a previous course. So Pragmatic Sanction is simply an executive order given by a king, an executive statement put up by the king. And it happened in multiple countries. They would do this. And it would be named for the place it was given and the date. So this one, the Pragmatic Sanction, the Royal Edict pertaining to international affairs, was given at Bruges, that's Brouges, in the year 1438. And this, it was an assertion of ecclesial nationalism. So the Pope should just be a figurehead, a spiritual, figurehead, but the actual jurisdiction over the French Church should just be handled by the French. So he's doing it because he's invading the papal state. So you see, this is how the politics and the religion, they just keep getting intertwined. And, this isn't the Pope's fault. He's just being attacked. So this guy wants to steal part of the papal state, and he's using a theological heresy as a way to try to undermine the Pope prior to that. And Louis XII even summoned a council, a church council. Of course, it wasn't a real one, but a pseudo council, to meet at Pisa in 1511 to declare Julius II deposed, that he was no longer Pope. Of course, it wasn't a real council, but Louis's allies that would buy it. Julius hired a condottieri army, mercenary army of Swiss, to join the troops sent by his Spanish allies to engage the French invasion. Ultimately, it went on for a while, but ultimately the Papal Alliance inflicted a series of 3 defeats on the French, driving Louis XII off of Italian soil by the end of 1512. Same year, 1512. Now he owed the Spanish, because the Spanish sent him troops to protect the Papal State, so now he was in their debt, and they collected. Because he had no choice, Julius granted to the Spanish crown the right to collect all tithes in the New World, a percentage of which would be used to defray the cost of supporting the missionary effort. But instead of just the tithes going directly to the church, it would be managed by the Royal Council, and then they would decide what to spend the money on. Also, same year, 1512, Julius had to agree to the Passe Regio. That's Passeregio, which, his agreement, that no papal letters, correspondence, could enter Spanish dominions or Spanish colonies without going to the Royal Council first. And the reverse is true. So by agreeing to this, the Pope was agreeing that he would not write directly to Spanish bishops, but instead a letter he wanted to send to, say, Bishop Juan, he would send first to the Royal Council. They would read it. And if they decided to, then they would forward it to the bishop. Then if the bishop had to respond, he could not just send it to Pope Julius. He had to send it to the Royal Council first. And they would read it. And if they decided to, then they would forward it to Julius. So again, a huge concession. All right, same year, 1512, October 4th, Martin Luther received his licentiate in theology and began teaching at Wittenberg. The following year, October 9th, 1513, he received his doctorate in theology and began teaching finally what he wanted. All these years, he was just enduring scholastic theology in order to get to this, was biblical theology. That's what he really wanted. His inaugural series of lectures after getting his doctorate was on the Book of Psalms. Same year, the 18th Ecumenical Council was summoned by Pope Julius II. This is the 5th Lateran Council. So the 5th Council to meet at the Lateran Palace. The St. John Lateran is the cathedral of the Pope in his capacity as Bishop of Rome, and there's a palace next to it, so that's where they met. Having achieved his objectives of restoring direct control over the Papal State and driving the French out of Italy, Julius decided to take on church reform, addressing the long-standing feudalism problems. To this end, he summoned the 18th Ecumenical Council. This council consisted of 12 sessions over a 5-year period. The first 5 sessions took place during the last year of Pope Julius's life. Session 1 opened on May 10th, 1512, which consisted of routine business of convocation and outlining procedures. Session 2, May 17th, 1512, condemned what it called the conciliabuli, the little quasi-council, the little fake council of Pisa, which I alluded to, that Louis XII called, because it was obviously it was a farce. It was a contrived attack on papal authority as a prelude to the French invasion. So it condemned it. Session 3, December 3rd, 1512, condemned all measures sponsored by that schismatic council of Pisa, and formally removed from the College of Cardinals those who participated in it on the grounds of schism and heresy. The decree even names them, lists their names. There are, 4 of them. Session 4, December 10th, 1512, formally condemned the pragmatic sanction of Bruges, which I alluded to already, and the Gallicanism it embodied, which is ecclesial nationalism. Its colorful phrasing was as follows, quote, "We do not wish to endure farther a thing so pernicious and offensive to God, a clear cheapening of and damage to Holy Church." Session 5, February 16th, 1512, condemned the sin of simony yet again. We've seen many councils do that. It's part of the feudalism problem, which is the purchase of the sacrament, specifically the purchase of ecclesiastical office, like purchasing ordination as a bishop. That this would be the feudalism problem. That so the duke would purchase ordination of as a bishop for a younger son. Then that son would be expected to use the resources of that diocese for the benefit of the family. Then Pope Julius II died of a fever on February 21st, 1513. At that point, the council was suspended. You can't have a council without a pope, so then it would be up to his successor to continue it or not. His successor, as the 217th pope, was Leo X, and it was in the reign of Leo X that the Protestant movement began. So we've laid the foundations for it already. We've seen England, the laying the foundations there. We've met Luther. He's going to in Germany. We've seen the problem of Swiss mercenaries, and believe it or not, that is going to be connected to the Protestant movement. So we laid all the groundwork, and next, in the reign of Leo, we're going to move into the actual event. So we will pause there. Next time, we will pick up with the reign of Pope 217, Leo X. For now, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.